When it appeared, the NSX represented a seismic shift. Not only was it the fastest, most expensive, most exotic Japanese production car ever, it also worked. And that was as impactful as its cutting-edge aluminum structure and sophisticated mid-mounted dual-overhead cam VTEC power plant. Today, we tend to forget that. Almost 19,000 of them were built over a 15-year period, and for every generation of car enthusiasts since, the idea that there should be a world-class sports car that is also easy to live with on a daily basis has been a given. Yes, the 911 had long occupied that role, but its architecture and packaging dated back to the early 1960s, and that brought a whole host of compromises and peculiarities, both in terms of ergonomics and dynamics. The NSX was free from those, and it took livability to the next level. The foundation that this car laid formed the basis for not only the Nissan GT-R, but also the Audi R8 and nearly every other contemporary mainstream standard production supercar. The traditionalists and Luddites worry that things have gotten too easy when it comes to driving sports cars, and indeed this complaint was leveled by some against the NSX when it first appeared. For those people, this car was too soft, too civilized, too accessible, and just a little bit dull. The car for them is the NSX Type-R. It's still easy to drive, but it has a hard edge that transforms the pleasant, enjoyable NSX into a magical, transcendent driving experience that obliterates any complaints of dullness. To make sense of the NSX, it's critical to understand where Honda Motor Company came from. So Ichiro Honda did not attend a prestigious university, or any university in fact. He began as a mechanic who would not be considered for a job at Toyota because of his lack of academic pedigree. For decades, his company was defined by an independent, innovative approach that consistently saw the company selling visionary products that mainstream manufacturers would often mimic once Honda demonstrated that the ideas worked. They began with piston rings, then became the world's largest manufacturer of motorcycles, and by the 1960s, they made their first car. It was not a sensible practical economy car, but rather a jewel of a sports car, a chain-drive 9,500 RPM roadster with individual throttle bodies. They did ultimately transition to more pedestrian cars, but that didn't stop them from innovating. The 1973 Civic featured the CVCC engine, whose unique combustion process allowed the car to meet the new American emission standards that were so tough that GM fought to delay or relax them. And Honda's engine met these standards without even using any emissions equipment. GM claimed that this was because it was a tiny economy car engine and that a real car couldn't use this technology. So Honda bought a 350 cubic inch V8 powered Chevy Impala and converted the motor to use CVCC technology, and it too met the new emission standards without any smog equipment. In the 1980s, Honda was the first Japanese manufacturer to build a plant in America, and it produced a car that was designed specifically for American preferences, the 1983 Accord. This critical car proved to be a turning point for most foreign manufacturers. Toyota saw the brilliance of making a car tailored to our unique desires and followed suit, as have many others. Honda was also the first Japanese company to produce a dedicated upmarket brand for the US, ACURA, in 1986. Toyota and Nissan followed a few years later. The point of all this is to demonstrate the visionary approach that Honda took toward making cars, even if they had not produced a genuine sports car in decades when the NSX appeared. This meant that the NSX could be a clean sheet design, both technically and aesthetically. The NSX could live up to its name. N for new, S for sports, and X for X, as in the unknown. The project was led by the now legendary Shigeru Uehara, and the goal was to create something completely new. The car would offer something that no other car company had ever produced before, an apparently impossible combination of usability, performance, and driver enjoyment that simply did not exist in any other car when the NSX's development began in January of 1984. The car's development was slow and painstaking, 6.5 years. It was not replacing anything internally in Honda, nor was it copying anything made by anyone else. It was a flagship car whose purpose was to showcase the same technical brainpower that saw a slew of Honda-powered cars dominate the world's most prestigious motorsport from the mid-80s into the early 90s, Formula One. At its core, this new car would be a driver's car, and all the fundamental decisions were made with this in mind. For a low polar moment of inertia, the engine would be mounted amidships in an aluminum chassis whose design was optimized by a Cray supercomputer to reduce its weight by some 40% compared to a steel monocoque. But it didn't end here. The fuel tank was placed immediately behind the occupants to keep the weight well inside the wheelbase and not alter the weight distribution as the fuel tank level changed. The bumpers were specifically engineered for lightness since they were the farthest points away from the car's center of mass. The engine was transversely mounted to keep the wheelbase as short as possible, while the highest parts of the engine, the intake components and valve covers, were magnesium to lower the center of gravity. The engine itself shows the same type of thinking. The 90-degree V6 employs titanium connecting rods, which are strong but light, while dual overhead cam, 4-valve heads, and an 8,000 RPM redline give a remarkable 90 horsepower per liter from a car with a 7,500-mile service interval that can literally be serviced at a Honda dealer. And it was so economical that the car was exempt from gas guzzler tax. This was due in no small part to some electronic trickery. A variable volume intake system provides torque down low, and airflow, and thus power, up high, while Honda's patented VTEC system adjusts cam timing and lift at high RPM to improve breathing without sacrificing economy or flexibility in normal driving. It was in this car that this now iconic technology made its US debut. Honda's engineering-first approach was obvious in the suspension design as well. Aluminum double wishbones at all four corners provide optimal geometry during suspension travel and reduce unsprung weight, which in turn allows softer springs and dampers, simultaneously improving ride comfort and road adhesion on bumpy roads. There's cleverness in the car's footwear even. The forged wheels are an inch smaller at the front than at the rear, as on an open-wheeled race car. This serves to lower the nose profile, reduce the size of the cabin wheel well intrusions, and take advantage of the fact that the car has more weight on the rear wheels and thus requires bigger tires and more traction at the back than at the front. Speaking of tires, Honda spent 2 years jointly developing a bespoke tire for the car with Yokohama. The car finally bowed in prototype form in early 1989, more than a year before production began. The following month, at the Geneva Motor Show, the cover was pulled off the car by none other than Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, teammates and rivals at McLaren, who were in the midst of seeing McLaren Honda through their most successful period in F1. What the public saw when the NSX was unveiled was simultaneously a product of its era, yet also timeless and unfussy. It has very few gimmicks. Clean, efficient, and well-proportioned, the car resisted fads like digital gauges or an enormous wing. There were no recent Honda sports cars with which it needed to have visual continuity, and it stands on its own aesthetically. Some media outlets found it to be a bit plain, but this attribute is probably why it has aged so well. The driving impressions of the car were anything but plain, however. Journalists were tremendously impressed not only with how good the car was, but how easy it was. Car and Driver observed that this was the first time that a real car company that satisfies millions of customers each year has applied itself to building a mid-engine supercar. Road and Track described it as an Accord when you want it to be. In spite of all that, it's an engaging car to drive that still satisfies the accomplished driver. Australia's publication Wheels described it as undemanding but hugely capable, a car that you drive with brain and fingertips, not biceps and bravado like a Lamborghini. Meanwhile, Automobile called it the most cooperative and best handling mid-engine car we've driven. Motor Trend described it as a half-price Ferrari 348, but that's a lie. This is a far better car. Today, a good one costs more than a 348, and that tells the real story.
So I can't be like Senna today.
If anything was missing from the NSX, it was a hard racy edge, in much the same way that there is room for a more sporting variant of the 911 beyond the base Carrera. The thing that made the NSX so usable also made it a little bit dull for the hardcore enthusiast. This objection is absolutely demolished by the NSX Type-R, which was introduced in late 1992. Sadly available only for the Japanese market, the Type-R is one of those cars whose changes appear to be relatively incremental, but which completely transform the driving experience. Cars like any Porsche Carrera RS or the Ferrari 360 Challenge Stradale. The recipe of the NSX Type-R is exactly what every enthusiast hopes for: less weight, a tuned engine, and upgraded suspension with the added bonus of shorter gearing. The car weighs 265 pounds less than the standard car thanks to the removal of underseal and a fair amount of equipment, as well as lighter body panels including bumper, rear deck lid and engine cover, and even lightweight carpeting and thinner glass between the passenger compartment and the engine. The list of equipment removed is impressive: spare tire, airbag, cruise control, central locking, power mirrors, air conditioning, and stereo system, the latter two of which could be added back in as options. The interior gained composite Recaro seats along with a titanium shift knob reportedly modeled on that of the McLaren Honda F1 racing cars. What used to be a 1990s Japanese take on luxury, complete with gathered leather, is now a purposeful cockpit for the business of driving. Mechanically, the Type-R received a balanced engine with a less restrictive exhaust system, although no more power was claimed, while the final drive ratio was shortened from 406 to 423, a welcome change given that the second gear was good for an absurd 82 miles an hour in the standard NSX. The springs, shocks, and bushings were firmed up, and the ride height lowered, and some structural reinforcement added in the suspension subframes and engine compartment. Finally, lighter, larger wheels were fitted with stickier tires and a red Honda badge added on the nose. Available in a variety of colors, the NSX Type-R did come in a color specific to the model: Championship White, a creamier shade of white to evoke the Honda Formula One racing cars of the 1960s. Just 500 first-generation Type-Rs were built, and the resulting car is a sensation. Around the Nürburgring, it was 13 seconds faster than the standard NSX despite not having any more power, reportedly, and its lap time was faster than that of a Porsche 911 Turbo. These feats are impressive, but don't convey the experience of driving this car. The best thing about how the Type-R drives is that it is almost completely transparent. Every so often, a car comes along that is so natural, so instinctive, feels so much like an extension of yourself that it disappears when you're driving it. Instead of focusing on the act of managing the car, the driver focuses on driving. The Type-R is like that. It's an incredibly balanced car, not just in terms of how the chassis behaves, but in terms of how all the systems work together. It has superb control harmony. The weighting, placement, and texture of each of the controls is well matched and perfectly judged. Despite being mid-engined, it offers excellent visibility, 312 degrees worth. The throttle response, shift action, and the placement and feel of the brake pedal are optimal for heel towing, while the engine is a revvy thing that sounds spectacular, with each trip through the rev range providing a spine-tingling evolution in sound. It has a classic, naturally aspirated sports car feel, with a linear build of power that makes it rewarding to rev out instead of pummeling the driver, chassis, and tires with lumps of unmanageable torque at 1800 RPM. The chassis is perfectly set up to exploit the powertrain with tremendous grip, excellent handling balance, and just the right amount of motion to convey that the chassis is working without upsetting the car's line or feeling floaty. The resulting car is one that is incredibly competent, but also communicates in very plain terms what it's doing and how it's going. This enables the driver to jump in and immediately drive it quite quickly. Its reactions are exactly as you expect. The car responds keenly to every request in a way that will make any enthusiast giggle. And you get all of this on the street. And that perhaps is the greatest joy of the NSX Type-R. The car is righteously fast and enjoyable on a technical road, but its limits are not so outrageously high that they can't be periodically visited, unlike most of today's super and sports cars. And it does so with a texture and mechanical clarity that simply isn't present in conventional production cars anymore. The car revels in being wound out in second and third gears, and then back down to second. It is easy and delightful to take the car near its limit at these speeds, and it is so unfalteringly good at this that it feels like it could do it forever. It gives the driver a sense of accomplishment and enjoyment by engaging in lucid dialogue that sets the car apart as one of the great driver's cars of all time.
It's very good.
There are no excuses or workarounds from driver or car. It is, simply put, driving bliss. In every sense, the NSX Type-R is a monument to the glorious legacy of Honda's defiantly visionary character. It is a perfect expression of their philosophy of trailblazing that has seen other manufacturers following Honda's lead too many times to count. And best of all, the NSX Type-R does it for the sheer pleasure of driving.